They stalked highways, beaches, forests, and city streets. Dozens were found dead, but 0 arrests were made. But these aren't urban legends. These are 5 real serial killers who were never caught. And one of them could still be living next door. From New York to New Mexico, this is the darkest side of true crime you've never seen. So, let's dive right in. In December 2010, a police officer and his cadaver dog were searching along the Gilgo Beach in New York for a missing woman named Shannan Gilbert. After a short while, the dog clearly got a lead, and so he started pulling his handler towards the sand dune. And when the officer got a little closer, he could clearly see that there was something buried underneath the sand. When he uncovered it, he knew he had to call for backup. His dog just successfully led him to human remains. But as it would soon turn out, this discovery would be the start of something much bigger, because the remains did not belong to the missing woman Shannan. Within days, the remains of 4 more women were discovered, with each being spaced about 500 feet apart. They were all wrapped in burlap, which is this type of woven thick fabric. And one interesting detail that was connecting them all was the fact that these women were believed to be sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. So does that mean that someone went to target them one by first contacting them on the website and then meeting them here at the beach? Either way, this gruesome discovery absolutely stunned Long Island. But little did they know that this was just the beginning. Over the next year, authorities would find 10 bodies in total. Some dismembered, some decomposed, and all were located across Oak Beach and its surrounding areas. The press immediately jumped onto this and quickly dubbed the unknown killer as the Long Island serial killer, or LISK for short. When the investigators started to compare these cases, they noticed some disturbing patterns across all these women. Most victims were petite and young, many had worked in the sex trade, and some were even last seen meeting clients. Eventually, the investigators would also find the body of the missing Shannan Gilbert, but her case immediately stood apart. She was found a year later in a marsh, with the cause of her death never officially linked to LISK. But that is not what the public thought. Some began to speculate that maybe she was LISK's target, but that she managed to escape and flee. On the day she went missing, Shannan actually managed to dial 911, and I've got a recording of it right here for you.
State police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
You're driving right now?
No, I'm inside the house.
I'm sorry?
I'm inside the house.
What house?
I don't know. Can you trace where I am?
I'm sorry?
Can you trace where I am?
No, I can't. What's your callback number you're calling from?
Huh?
What phone number are you calling from?
Somebody's after me.
Shannan did escape the house of her client and was then seen running down the street. But after that, there was no other traces of her until she was found deceased on that beach. To this day, her 911 call remains as one of the eeriest pieces of evidence in this case. I have to wonder, why would the operator not be able to trace her call? At least point the phone into the direction of the nearby cell tower, but instead, Shannan did not get any help, and we know how that ended up for her. In 2023, a suspect named Rex Hoyerman was arrested. He was this architect living in the Mesa Park, and his DNA clearly linked him to at least 3 of the 10 victims. His case is still ongoing, but here is the twist. The full list of victims doesn't quite match the timeline or the modus operandi of one man. Law enforcement suspects multiple killers may have used the same dumping grounds, but the real question remains. Have they really caught the Long Island serial killer? Or is Rex just one of them? The main years the LISK were considered active was from 1996 to 2010, and so unless we get some real evidence, these murders might go on as forever unsolved. Virginia's Colonial Parkway is this very picturesque tree-lined road. It's quiet, isolated and historic. But in the late 1980s, it was the site of something nightmarish. A series of murders so deliberate and so chilling, they shook the region to its core. Between 1986 and 1989, 4 couples were either found murdered or went missing along or near the Colonial Parkway. All were either killed in their vehicles or they left their cars behind in these very eerie stage conditions. The first victims were Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. These 2 women were found in their car near Lover's Lane with throats slashed so deep they were nearly decapitated. Their vehicle had been pushed over the embankment, but surprisingly there were no defensive wounds and no signs of struggle. So what happened to them and who did it? A year later, David Knobling and Robin Edwards went missing after their date. Their bodies were later found in the woods, but again, there were no witnesses and there was no apparent motive. Then came the pair of Cassandra Haley and Richard Cole, who were these college students. And they were last seen after a party in 1988, and their car was found abandoned, but their bodies, they were never recovered. And finally, in 1989, Danielle Lower and Anna Marie Phelps disappeared while traveling to Virginia Beach. Their car was parked facing the wrong direction on an interstate off-ramp, and a month later, that is when the remains were finally found. They were in the nearby woods, covered with a blanket with signs of stab wounds. Now, despite the clear pattern, the FBI refused to officially link the murders for decades. Apparently, there was little physical evidence, and DNA wasn't really yet reliable. But locals knew someone was using the parkway as their hunting grounds, and that someone was very likely familiar with its layout. Speculations have pointed to a rogue law enforcement officer, since the victims often complied without a struggle. And others think it could have been a long-haul trucker or maybe even a park ranger. But even now, over 30 years later, the Colonial Parkway Killer has never been caught. There have never been any official suspects arrested, and so these cases have gone completely cold. But questions remain. Who was the killer? And are they still around, waiting to pounce again? By the way, if this has already given you chills, then just wait, we are only 2 killers in. There are 3 more twisted, real-life monsters ahead. So if you're into cold cases, dark history, and real horror that doesn't need a jump scare, then do hit that subscribe button, because these stories, they're just starting out. In the early 1970s, Washington, D.C. wasn't just a political battleground. It was also the hunting ground of one of the most elusive serial killers in American history. He was bold, fast, and silent. They called him the Freeway Phantom. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 young black girls between the ages of 10 and 18 disappeared from DC and the nearby Prince George's County, Maryland. Each time, the killer struck without warning. The girls vanished, some walking to the store and some coming home from school, and they were later found dumped near highways. Despite their young age, they had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and left out there like garbage. But it wasn't just the brutality that caught investigators off guard. It was the eerie level of control. One girl's body was discovered within hours of her abduction, suggesting the killer did take some terrifying risks to do that. And in another case, the killer made the victim write a note to the police, which was later found in her pocket. And it said, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can." The handwriting was confirmed to be the girls, and so they weren't really any leads the investigators could pursue after finding this very chilling discovery. Police interviewed hundreds, including gang members, known sex offenders, and even a former cop, and at one point the FBI believed the killer might have had ties to law enforcement, or at least the military, which means the killer could have been someone with the means to evade capture and manipulate victims quickly. One lead even pointed to a notorious gang named the Green Vega Boys, who were known for abductions and assaults in the area. But nothing came ever back as confirmed. The case slowly slipped into obscurity and got buried under other tragedies and administrative failures. Today, many people outside of DC have never heard of the Freeway Phantom. But the families, some of whom are still alive, they have not forgotten. But sadly, with no DNA, fingerprints or witnesses, these cases still remain cold. Here's the chilling part though. Some people believe that the killer did not stop, he just moved to a different area. He could have changed cities and also his tactics. Or maybe he's still watching and still waiting. It was February 2009 when a woman in Albuquerque, New Mexico, took her dog for a walk near a construction site on the city's West Mesa. But not too long into the walk, the dog suddenly began to dig. But what got unearthed that day was not a bone from a cow or coyote, it was a human femur. This very unexpected discovery triggered a massive excavation, but nobody was really prepared for what the investigators were about to find. Over the next weeks, 11 bodies were lifted from a shallow mass grave. Most of these victims were young women, many of whom had disappeared between 2003 and 2005. Almost all had ties to sex work and drugs, and all had vanished from the same rough part of Albuquerque's East Central Avenue, which is this area plagued by poverty, addiction, and also silence. Naturally, the word got out pretty quickly, and everybody started calling this unknown perpetrator as the West Mesa bone collector. The investigators were determined that these women were actually murdered elsewhere, and then they were transported and buried in what was then a desolate, undeveloped patch of desert. In many ways, this was actually the perfect dumping ground. It was out of sight and out of mind. But at the time, the killer likely hadn't expected the city to expand and for bulldozers to uncover his secret cemetery. Police did manage to identify most of the victims, including the deceased teenagers. But surprisingly, there were no bullet holes, no DNA, and no eyewitnesses. Over time, several suspects emerged though. One was Lorenzo Montoya, who was this local man with a history of violence against sex workers. In 2006, just before the disappearance stopped, he strangled a teenage girl, but he was then killed by her boyfriend in what seemed to be a self-defense. And after his death, the murders seemed to stop. This of course looked very promising, but unfortunately there was never any hard evidence that would have tied Montoya to the burial site, and so the investigators had to look elsewhere. Soon they found another suspect, a former law enforcement officer who lived near the dumping ground and was later accused of abusing women. But even with this, still no charges were filed. And just like with the previous case, people started to speculate whether the killer just moved elsewhere and found himself a new dumping ground. This could have been somewhere deeper, even more remote, and most importantly, still undiscovered. Today, a memorial sits where the bones were found, but no killer has ever been brought to justice. And so the West Mesa still holds its secrets. In the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, Cleveland, Ohio was already a city in crisis. But a new horror emerged, one the newspapers quickly dubbed the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The first torso appeared in 1934, headless, genitals removed, and also bloodless, which suggested that the body had been drained before it got dismembered. And then came another and another. Over the next few years, at least 12 victims, but some say up to 20, were found dismembered and mutilated in or around the Kingsbury Run, a ravine that cut through the poorest areas of Cleveland. The victims were mostly men, many homeless or transient, and often decapitated. Some had their torsos cut in half, and a few were soaked in lime to hasten decomposition. And I wonder if this is where Brian X. Killer got the idea from. And if you haven't heard about this case, then oh boy, are you in for a wild one. You can find a link to that episode right in the description down below. Overall, there was this level of brutality to the killings that suggested more than rage. It felt almost clinical and even surgical. So some investigators believed that the killer had medical training, and the others believed that he was a butcher or someone familiar with the anatomy. The city turned to its most famous lawman, Elliot Ness, who was the very man who took down Al Capone. At the time, he was the Cleveland's director of public safety, and Ness poured resources into this case. He raided shantytowns, interrogated hundreds, and even burned down the entire homeless camps, hoping to flush the killer out. But nothing worked. At one point, a suspect named Dr. Francis Sweeney got interrogated. He was this troubled World War I veteran and a pathologist, and it's believed that he could be the killer. But Sweeney had very powerful political connections, and so just like that, he was never formally charged. Eventually, the murder stopped, or maybe they just moved elsewhere, because the common result of the Great Depression was the fact that many people looked for different places to relocate to. To this day, the Torso murderer's identity remains unknown, but he left behind something worse than bodies. The sense that evil had walked among the forgotten and thrived in their shadows. So there you have it, 5 killers, dozens of victims, and zero justice. What chills me the most is the fact that some of them might have never even stopped, and they all got away with it. But which case haunted you the most? I'd love to read your theories in the comments, and if this video left you looking over your shoulder, just imagine what the next one will do. Until next time.